We saw at the end of the last video that Americans think that we have more inequality than they would like, and they actually think we have less inequality than we actually do. So how much inequality is too much? And then we'll talk about that right now. And then in the next video, we'll talk about what, if anything, we can do about it. So one of the issues about that influences how people think about inequality is whether or not people think that people who are poor because they made bad decisions, they're lazy, they didn't work hard, they didn't make the right decisions about education, or whether they think they're poor because they had bad luck, were born poor, they are discriminated against, etc. And so a lot of that has to do with what we call procedural justice, right? Is everybody given a fair share, a fair chance at success? If people believe that people do have a fair chance at success, then they're less likely to want to do something about inequality than if people believe that they don't have a fair chance at success. So when we think about this, we can sort of see um, how people believe, whether or not they want to do something about it. So here on the vertical axis, we have support or opposition to redistribution. So above the zero line is support for redistribution, and below the zero line is opposition to redistribution. And so you can see that if men believe that gender matters and inequality, they're more in favor of redistribution. If white people think that race matters in inequality, they're more in favor of redistribution. Education, parents, connections, luck, right? All of these things that people don't have control over, as long as people believe that those things matter in terms of inequality, then they are more in favor of redistribution. Um, Inheritance, race for black people, gender for women. Uh, then risk taking matters, right? So, oh, well, people are rich because they took the risks, they took a chance, and now they're rich. That's good. Or hard work matters. All you have to do is work hard and you can succeed. Those two groups are opposed to redistribution. So, a lot of people's views about redistribution really has to do with where they think income inequality comes from in the first place. So if we think about sort of where we can end up, we want to think about uh, how much income the poor have versus how much income the rich have. And so we're going to walk through a bunch of different possibilities and think about where we want to be as a society. So some people say, hey, everybody should have the same amount, right? So that's going to be one option. John Rawls, who was a philosopher and talked about inequality a lot, said, we shouldn't necessarily have the same amount, but we should choose the rules under which the poor are as rich as they can be, right? So there's always going to be a poorest person, a poorest family, a poorest household in society, but we want to make them as rich as possible. And that might mean that we need some level of inequality to provide incentives in order to uh, produce as much as possible and make that family as well off as possible. Or we could decide, hey, we just want the people who are as rich to be as rich as possible. We're in charge, and therefore that's what we choose. And so let's look at some of the options here. So this graph has income of the poor along the horizontal axis and income of the rich along the vertical axis. And anything along the 45-degree line is equality. And so there's going to be some maximum output where everybody is equal. That might be pretty low, right? So if you have a society in which your income does not depend on how hard you work, then a lot of people might choose not to work hard at all, and therefore they won't produce much, and therefore the country will be poor. On the other hand, you could have a country where everybody works hard because they feel like they benefit from working hard, and everybody contributes, everybody receives the same amount, and therefore we have a relatively rich country. I can imagine both of them. You can see both of them, both in terms of history and in terms of people choosing different lifestyles. But it's probably not the most realistic for a large industrialized country. So Rawls said what we should do is choose this point here where the poor are as rich as possible, right? It doesn't mean they have the same amount of income as the rich, but they're as rich as they could be. And so that would, have higher redistribution, have higher taxes, etc. We can think of the slope of this feasible frontier as the marginal rate of transformation. How are we transforming the income of the poor into the income of the rich, or vice versa? It's going to have a maximum slope of -1, meaning that every dollar that the poor lose goes to the rich here at point A. There's going to be some maximum income for the rich, right? Here at point F, that's as rich as the rich can possibly be. And then there's some minimum feasible income of the poor. If they have any less income, then they die. And so then they're not poor anymore, I guess. So where are we going to choose to be? Well, that's going to depend, just like in our general economic choices, on our preferences, right? As a society. Where do we want to be along this feasible frontier? And that's going to depend on how averse we are to inequality, right? If we don't want too much inequality, then maybe we are at point B, right? Maybe it's not quite as rich as the poor can be, but we're not, up here at point F where the rich are as rich as they can be and the poor are pretty poor. So that's a possibility, right? And we can see countries that have made different choices along this feasible frontier. We saw that Sweden was much closer to, point B than to point A or point F. We saw the United States maybe was closer to point A than to point B. So all of these are possibilities. The term inequality aversion refers to not necessarily being completely altruistic and saying, oh, I don't care where I am, but having some level of self-interest, but also some preference for fairness, whether we're talking about fairness in terms of outcome or fairness in terms of procedure. And so if we feel like we want to make sure everybody at least has enough to eat and has a fair chance at being successful, then we have some level of inequality aversion.